Would you share, when did you start blowing shofar?
Yeah, I was going to start with that actually. So I think I was around 6 or 7 years old, and I was over at friends of my parents for Sukkot. And we were sitting outside for the sukkah, in the sukkah, and having dinner. And after dinner, I was, young, and I wanted to explore someone else's home because that's what kids do. And I found a shofar similar in size to this one. And I asked them if I could try it. Because, I'd heard it, and I had always been enamored by the Ba'al Tikiyah, the person who blew the shofar in our synagogue. He happens to be a very gifted brain surgeon, and he just had this clarity, like what you described. I mean, never missed a beat, and his truah, which we'll talk about in a little bit, was just unbelievable. It just, like, you could hear every single note, but it had this amazing fluency to it. And so I literally spent the next 2 hours at dinner blowing the shofar around the house and outside in the sukkah. My parents were gonna have to pry it out of my hands in order to take me home. Exactly. And then I think within a year or two, my grandfather had bought me my first shofar. It was about, I guess, half the size of this one. And then this one was bought for me a few years later. And I've been blowing the shofar ever since at high holiday services and youth services, when I've had various pulpit congregations over the course of time. And I've always been fascinated, not just by the sound that it makes, but what it does to us. It is very transformational, I find, and it elicits a visceral reaction to people that is often something we're not expecting. And so I love that piece. And so the reason I prefaced the discussion tonight with what should we be doing is because on one hand, there is no right answer. And on the other hand, there's a lot of stuff that our tradition tells us about what we should and shouldn't be doing. Is there anyone on Zoom, I'm just curious, that can hear me, that is paying attention, just watching me make a fool of myself? Okay. So what I want to do with you tonight is I want to try to look at a very large cross-section of sources to help you understand what the shofar is, what the rabbis of our tradition wrestled with in putting this ritual into practice, and also to understand what's at the core of the ritual itself. Most people think, or many people think, that what's at the core is that you have to sound the shofar. And I actually would argue that that's not the purpose of it. But you have to sound it in order to get to the purpose. So we're going to talk a little bit about it. If you look, you can either look up there on the screen or you can look in front of you. But I wanted to just highlight for a moment 2 texts, there's 3 in total, that talk about Rosh HaShana in the Torah. The first one is from Leviticus, from Vayikra. And it's when God tells Moses to tell the people, "B'chodesh hashvi'i b'echad l'chodesh yeh lachem Shabbaton." On the 7th month, on the first day of the month, you're going to have a Shabbaton, which doesn't mean like a group of kids all getting together to go hang out with each other, but it's some kind of Sabbath-like experience. And then it says, Zichron Trua Mikra Kodesh. It will be a day of commemoration of the loud blasts, or commemorating with loud blasts. Rosh HaShana, the name itself, is not in the Torah. It's called Yom Truah, the day of the Truah. I'm going to intentionally leave that untranslated for a moment because it's ambiguous, and we'll see why in a few minutes. And then in the book of Numbers, it says, on the 7th month, the first day of the month, you're going to observe a sacred occasion. Don't work. Don't work. Right, okay. You shall observe it as a day, Yom Truah Yelachem, a day of the Truah. So let's parse a couple things. First of all, when does Rosh Hashanah happen? What month does it happen in the Torah? The 7th. Why is that surprising to you?
New Year.
It's the New Year. When might you think Rosh Hashanah would happen? Could you imagine if we changed it from December 31st to July 1st? Everyone would, be lost. So what's it talking about here? Why is it that the Hebrew month is the 7th month, which is the one where we observe Rosh Hashanah, and not the first month? Anyone know? What is the first month in the Torah?
There are numbers of first months, aren't there?
Good. So there's number of firsts for sure. There are actually 4 different Jewish New Years in Jewish tradition, but we don't notice that until we get to rabbinic period, until the Mishnah. And what are they? Rosh Hashanah, the month of Pesach, the month of Shvat, when we celebrate the trees and the environment, and the month of Elul, the month that we're in now, which is when we tithe all of our animals, because when we get to Rosh HaShana and Yom Kippur and Sukkot, we're going to offer a lot of sacrifices. And so the first month in Jewish tradition is actually the month that marks the Exodus from Egypt, because that's the month when we become a people. And so in the Torah, it counts from there, whereas Rosh Hashanah, according to the Mishnah, is the month that marks the anniversary of Hayom Harat Olam, the day that the world was either created or conceived or born. Meaning when we say 5,780, which we'll say in about a week and a half, 2 weeks, God help me, we will say that that is the anniversary of the day of creation. Now, that's not to say, evolutionarily speaking, that creation happened 5,780 years ago, but the counting system is for a different class. But presumably that's the orientation of our world in parallel to where it was when we were created. So that's the anniversary that we are marking. When you think about the ram's horn for a moment, what story in the Torah do you typically associate with the ram's horn? Isaac, why? That's exactly right. So the quick summary of it, in Genesis 22, in the morning, God calls to Abraham and says, get up and take your firstborn son, Isaac, and go and sacrifice him on the altar in a place I'm going to show you. You're going to go on a journey for a few days, and then I'll give you more instructions. It's a whole complicated mess of a story. We spend years and years trying to unpack it and understand it. It's a class unto itself. But at the very end, right as Abraham is about to take the knife to the throat of his son Isaac, God says, hold it, buddy, stop. He says, Vayomer Abraham, 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 and he says, Hineni, here I am. And ultimately, in the middle of the page, it says, and Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, there was a ram caught in the thicket and by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering, as a sacrifice in place of his son. And so the ram's horn caught in the thicket is the substitution for sacrificing his son. And so the symbolism of the horn is something that we draw from the story, and we put it into our liturgy. We put it into our story today. There's no sounding of the shofar here. There is no truah, tikiyah, gadolah. If you don't know what I'm talking about, we'll get to it in a second. There's no sounds here. It's literally a substitution. So the fact that this sheep here, or this ram here is doing that is just disgusting. I don't want to get into it. But ultimately, the shofar becomes a symbol of something much greater than this story. However, the Talmud in rabbinic tradition says, no, the shofar is really about this binding of Isaac story. Rabbi Abahu said, why do we sound the shofar? Because the Holy One, blessed be God, said, blow me a ram's horn that I may remember to your credit the binding of Isaac, the son of Abraham, and I shall account it to you as the binding of yourselves before me. Why do we sound the shofar, according to the Talmud? It's a reminder of a covenant. It's a reminder of a story. The shofar triggers something in our minds, and it helps us connect something of the past to the present. But in particular, what happens? What does it mean when God says, you know what, don't sacrifice your son, sacrifice the ram instead? What actually is going on in that moment?
Separating us from the communities near us, because they were still sacrificing and we didn't want to do it.
Great, and that's a very common interpretation. I think there's a lot of evidence to support it, which suggests that there were other peoples in the ancient world that were offering children as sacrifices, and in this moment, God is saying no more. We're not going to do it. So it's a reminder of that transition. Great. What else does it remind us of?
A test of loyalty.
Great, it's a test of loyalty. In some ways, Rosh HaShana and Yom Kippur is a test of our faith. Can we endure the rabbi's sermon again this year?
Yeah.
No. What's the test of faith, Bert? What are we testing? What's the test of faith?
I guess that you'll follow the word of the Lord.
Okay, great, that you'll follow the word of the Lord. What else? Why do people show up on Rosh HaShana and Yom Kippur? They want to be inscribed in the book of life. Great, what does that mean?
I'm trying not to say they don't want to die. But-
Well, in some ways, yes, that's true, right? There was a theology that if you showed up and you righted your wrongs, you did more good things than you did bad things, that you would have more bonus points in the good column and you would make it for another year. As opposed to the Unatana Tokef prayer, which we're going to look at later, which paints life as very fragile. And we're either going to live or we're going to die. And some are going to die this way or some are going to die that way. And we just don't know what's going to happen. Some of us might die by the sword, Isaac. And some of us might be spared from the sword, Isaac. So in some ways, the shofar is a reminder of the fragility of life, of us teetering on life and death. Let's think about it more broadly for a second. If we think about the shofar, when might we have used the shofar in Jewish tradition other than on high holiday services? Great, it's a calling of the people. What else? When would we call the people?
Well, if there's going to be war or
Great.
attack.
Great, so we would call people together if there was going to be war. Who here has been to Israel? Who here has been to Jerusalem? Who here has gone up to the Wailing Wall or the Kotel? Who here has gone to the other side where Robinson's Arch used to be? You can't see the arch anymore. It's where all of the big stones are. It's not where the mechitza, the dividing part, is between men and women. They might have showed you down where the market was, where the storefronts used to be. And they might have told you, look up at the corner right there. That was where, or down in that corner was where they would sound the shofar to let people know that market day had begun, or when market day had closed and it was time to go home and get ready for Shabbat. It was an alarm clock. It's time to go. It's time to get ready. So the shofar has been used in all kinds of different ways. But today we use it in a particular way. So let's talk about the sounds of the shofar. What are the sounds of the shofar? Tikiyah. What is tikiyah? All right, I'm going to model it for you the way that you might have heard it today. So call it for me. This is tikiyah. What's next? Shvarim. How many is shvarim? 3. What does the word shvarim mean? To break. Great. Something that's broken. So it might sound like this. Okay. What's the next one? Truah. Okay. What's truah? 9. Is that what that means? That today is Yom Truah? Today is the day of 9? No. What is truah?
We don't know.
It's not so clear, but most of us think that truah is a series of short staccato blasts ranging between 9 and 12 that are of equal length in total to the tikiyah and to the shvarim. So it might sound like this. What's the last one? Incorrect. No. Wait, hold, sorry. What did you say first? Tikiyah Gedolah, and you said? You said Tikiyah Gedolah, incorrect. It's tikiyah. It's just another solid blast. I'll get to the Tikiyah Gedolah in a second. All right, let's talk about it for a moment. On Rosh HaShana, how many times do we sound the shofar? How many blasts do we have? 100. How do we count to 100? 1, 2, 3. How do we count to 100 with shofar blasts?
Is it 1, 3, 9, or is it just 1, 1, 1, 1, 1?
1, 2, 3.
No, I'm saying is
It's
the
an
Tikiyah
interesting
1,
question.
Is the Shvarim 3, so that would be 4? Or is the Tikiyah 1, the Shvarim 1?
All right, so usually Tikiyah, Shvarim, Truah, Tikiyah, that's 4.
Okay.
Tikiyah, Shvarim, Tikiyah, 3. Tikiyah, Truah, Tikiyah, 3, total of 10. And we do that 10 times. Okay, but it's not that clear. Look on the screen or look in front of you on the second page. This is what the Mishnah tells us a truah is. I'm going to read it to you in Hebrew because it has a really nice sleel, a nice tone to it. It says the following: Seder tikiyot. The order of the tikiyot is shalosh shel shalosh shalosh. 3 sets of 3 threes. Shiur tikiyah keshalosh truot, shiur truah keshalosh yevavot. Here we go. Ready? The measurement of a tikiyah, that's the long one, the first one I did, is the sound of 3 truot. And the sound of each tikiyah is that of 3 yevavot. Did everyone get the math? Okay, I didn't either, so don't worry. This is old math. This is new math. Carry the 1. Here's the problem. I don't think we have a whiteboard in here, do we? Okay, so I want to imagine for a second. Let's imagine for a second that we have okay. Take a look at my drawing for a second. The first one is the tikiyah, the second one is the shavarim, and the third one is the truah. They're all the same length in total. They're just broken into different pieces. Okay? The question is, if this is a tikiyah up top, then the shavarim, which by the way is not named here, might be 3 forms of the tikiyah, like 3 pieces, 3 fractions. And the last one might be 9 fractions of it, 9 pieces of it. And what's not clear is what does it actually sound like? When we look at it in just a minute, if you were to skip down for a second to, skip to the top of the page on the next page, page 3, look at C. It's unclear what the shavarim sounds like. It either sounds like genuche ganach, sighing, or that of yelule yelil, sobbing. So I'm going to blow the shofar again for you. Some of you may have heard it sound like this.
Last one.
Has anyone ever heard the shofar sounded like that?
Yeah.
It's not an uncommon practice to sound the shofar like that because the sounding of the shofar was actually meant, perhaps, to convey emotion in the sound. All right, so let me say it again. If you were to imagine it the first way I did it, what would you say are the emotions ascribed to the first way? Strength. Bold. What else? Positive. Okay. Powerful. How about the second round that I just did? Sad, crying, when will it end? How many people will actually show up to hear the shofar if it always sounded like that? It's an interesting thing. Some people actually, when they sound the shofar, they go up. What did that evoke for you? Wake up, yes, great. What else? Strength.
It's like two things can exist at the same moment. Right?
Oh, interesting, right?
Yeah.
2 different emotions could exist in the same moment, like I'm awake and then whoa,
Yeah.
I'm jolted out of bed.
To me, I feel like it's happiness that you're in a new year, but you're also sad because the grants weren't reminding us that there aren't any sacrifices anymore. So
Right.
the temple is destroyed. So you should feel like at least somewhat sad.
Okay.
If you're feeling positive.
Great. Adriana, you just created a very nice analogy which juxtaposes 2 different sets of emotions. You might want to remember in this moment that there's a lot of sad stuff that's happened, but we also have a wake-up call here. Who can give me another ritual in Jewish tradition where we juxtapose emotions like that? The breaking of the glass at a Jewish wedding. Hey, who here has been to a Jewish wedding? Could you imagine what it would look like to go to a Jewish wedding and not break the glass? It would be a shanda, right? On some level, that may be what we're trying to do here, is create multiple competing emotions. We actually don't know what the sounds of the shofar sounded like. And this Mishnah, which was written around 200 of the Common Era, is trying to help us understand it. And so here's the thing. On a Rosh HaShana service, you will actually hear every possible combination that could exist. So you might hear the following combination: tikiyah, shvarim, trua, tikiyah, tikiyah, shvarim, tikiyah, or tikiyah, trua, tikiyah. We're going to say that the trua, remember it's Yom Trua, the day of the trua, we don't know what it means, so we're going to just do all of them to cover all of our bases. And that's exactly what we do. If you look at the service in the Machzor, we always have one set where the middle one is shvarim, trua, the middle one is just shvarim, and the bottom one is just trua. So this is what it would sound like. I'll do 3. So which one was the trua? It's kind of like I just put it in a cup and I moved it around and we don't know which one. We don't know. But I just played for you the full orchestra, if you will, the full symphony. What did you get out of that one?
I have the sense in contradistinction to the thought that this was a groan or a moan, that the way we do it with the uplifted note is Am Yisrael Chai.
Right? It might suggest in the time of the rabbinic period that it was a moan or a groan or a wail or a cry because of what you said, Adriana. They're talking about sounding the shofar in a moment after the destruction of the temple. So it's a wailing of sadness. What will it be like to be born again, to create something new out of ruins? And so maybe we're trying to play with the emotions here, and you get all of them depending on which sound you produce. So just so that we have some context, Julie, will you read a little bit? I want to just make sure we know what we're talking about when we're talking about a shofar. Will you just read A for a second? What a shofar has to be in order to be a kosher shofar? I'm on page 2, A, the first bullet.
The shofar should be fit for sounding. Shofar must be a ram's horn. Theoretically, the horn of any kosher animal except a cow or an ox may be used.
Why can we not use a cow or an ox? That's exactly right.
Golden calf.
The golden calf. The story in Exodus 32, 33, 34 is the story about the building of a golden calf. They throw it into this, fire, and out comes the golden calf. And then Piggy and all of the boys, gather around and they start dancing. Wait, that's the wrong story. That could have just as easily come out of the book. And they create this idol, if you will. So because of that memory, we don't do it. That's an interesting play on memory here, as opposed to the first story where we want to remember God sparing Isaac from the knife.
You would think they would have prohibited us from eating
Cow?
beef.
Yeah, that would have created a whole other issue.
The lamb industry wasn't.
Right,
strong
exactly. All right, go ahead, Julie.
The shofar should be bent or curved to symbolize the bent and humbled spirit appropriate on Rosh HaShana.
Okay.
The shofar may not be painted, but may be decorated with carved designs, although the outside may be covered with gold, so long as the outer texture of the shofar is not changed and the mouthpiece is not covered. The shofar may not be used if it is cracked along its length, unless enough space is left between the crack and the mouthpiece to fulfill the minimum requirement for the size of a shofar, about 6 inches. The shofar may not be used if it is cracked around its width and the crack is more than half its width.
Okay, lots of rules about what constitutes a kosher shofar. And you probably have seen all kinds of shapes and sizes. If you Google shofar under images, you will see all kinds. Big, small, twisty, not twisty. They actually measure them by their twists, right? This one I think is a 2 twist or something like that. I never remember. So lots of rules about what makes a shofar fit. Turn the page for a moment to page 3.
It's interesting that it can be covered with gold.
Yes.
Because of the gold.
It's interesting, right? So what would be the reason for it? Why could you cover it with gold?
So precious and item,
Yeah, that's true.
praising God.
It's a way of praising God. It's called Hidur Mitzvah, beautifying the mitzvah. That's why when you go to a store and you want to buy a mezuzah, you don't just buy the mezuzah. You could, buy the one for the Cubs or buy the one for your favorite TV show or whatever. Or when you buy a kippah, you don't just buy the plain kippah. You can get the one with your favorite team on it, or you can get whatever. We always like to beautify the mitzvah. The challah covers, the candlesticks, it's all merchandising. Hidur Mitzvah. Yeah, Hiddur. Or Hey Yud Daled Vibration.
I also like also that, to me, the way it's described seems like somewhat of a concession to people who, there was idol worshiping and they don't want to turn this into something that could be like an idol worship.
Yeah.
So you can't paint it, but you can do some other sort of decorative things to it.
Right.
It feels like a bit of.
In some ways, you can't do things to it that cause permanence. But if it's temporary, meaning you could take it on and off, not such a problem. Okay. All right, on page 3.
She had a-
Oh, sorry, Frida. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so blowing shofar on Shabbat, didn't they, the Kohanim and priests blow the shofar during?
They
temple times on
absolutely blew the
Shabbat?
shofar on Shabbat. They played musical instruments on Shabbat. They had all kinds of fun on Shabbat. Yes. So why did they stop?
That's a whole other.
Because you might be tempted to carry your shofar to shul on Shabbat.
That's the secondary reason. But you're on the right track. That's going to become the fence that they'll create around the law. We don't want you to take the shofar lest you carry it on Shabbat and be in violation of the laws around carrying. Meaning you can carry things if you're in a private domain, but if you're going from a public domain to a private domain, you're not allowed to do that. Whole other class. But why might we not want to blow the shofar on Shabbat post-temple? Why do we not play musical instruments? Why do many communities not play musical instruments on Shabbat post-temple times? It's a mourning thing, right? We are still mourning the temple. Some of us are still mourning the temple. And so in some ways we have removed those particular practices. Okay, so if you want to read on the top of C on page 3, it'll just give you kind of a summary of what I just described with the sounding of the shofar. What I want to get to, though, is what happens when we hear it. So at the bottom of page 3, toward the lower third, I've given you the bracha. There are 2 brachot that are recited when you sound the shofar. One of them is the shechianu, the blessing for reaching this moment in time. But the blessing itself is Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzibanu, for the one that sanctifies us with God's mitzvot and commands us lishmoa kol shofar, which means what? To hear the shofar. So I think you said the idea of shema. Was that right? When we were talking about who said shema? Oh, Ellen, you said shema? So the idea of listening, of hearing, is at the core of this mitzvah. Meaning, there's a whole section in the Talmud that talks about what happens if someone is deaf or is in the room. Can they fulfill the mitzvah of hearing the shofar? How?
By focusing on it internally,
So, all right. Originally, though, they're going to say, no, they're exempted from it. If you can't hear it, you can't fulfill the mitzvah. Now, there might be other ways to do it, but they're exempted. They're not prohibited. They're exempted from it. They can't fulfill the mitzvah. However, could they help someone else fulfill the mitzvah? That's right. So if someone who is deaf who could not hear, but could blow the shofar for someone else, they could help someone else fulfill the mitzvah, even if they can't fulfill it themselves. At the crux of this is not about blowing the shofar. It's about hearing the shofar, which is an interesting thing because the person who is sounding the shofar has to do both at the same time. Marty Eisenson. Yeah, what were you saying?
I was going to say, maybe lishmoa is to listen as well, right? And that's a more active term than hear, which is sort of passive in comparison.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
it's the act of listening.
Yes. Yes. But the question is, when you listen to the shofar, what are you listening for? What are you hoping to hear? In some ways, you all answered the question at the very beginning when we said, what's the experience that you have? Should you be able to hear all 100 blasts? Do you need to hear each one individually to make sure that we got 9 instead of 6? Do you need to make sure that you are hearing and then counting and seeing how long the Tikya Gedolah goes on for, and can that person get beyond a minute? What are you supposed to listen to? So I want to spend the rest of our time trying to understand that question. So look on the top of page 4. So on the top of page 4, this is a selection from Rambam, Maimonides, who's living in the 12th century in Spain. He was famous for many reasons. In particular, he wrote a beautiful code of law called the Mishnah Torah that was in beautiful, clear, lucid Hebrew. And he was also a physician and a philosopher and a theologian, and he weaves all of those different pieces into his law code, which caused a lot of criticism to be placed on him. But he offers a very interesting viewpoint of what happens when we sound the shofar, different from what we got in the Talmud. Remember, what did the Talmud say is the reason we blow the shofar? What are we remembering? That's right. To remind us about what happened with God and Isaac and Abraham and the whole binding of Isaac story. Maimonides offers a different take. Someone want to read? Top of page 4?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Top of page 4.
Yes.
Even though the blowing of the shofar on New Year is a biblical decree, nevertheless contains a deep meaning, as if to say, awake, sleepers, from your sleep. Rouse yourself, slumberers, from your slumber. Examine your deeds, return in repentance, and remember your Creator. Those who forget the truth and the vanities of time and spend their years on meaningless pursuits that neither profit nor save, look to your souls and improve your ways and works. Let each leave his ways that are bad and thoughts that are not good. Therefore, throughout the year, everyone should regard himself and the world as if evenly poised between innocence and guilt. If he commits a sin, he tilts the balance of his fate and that of the world to guilt, causing destruction. If he performs a good deed, he shifts the balance of his fate and that of the world to innocence, bringing salvation and deliverance to others. That is the meaning of biblical praise. The righteous person is the foundation of the world, namely, that by an act of righteousness we influence the fate of and save the world.
Okay. So what is Maimonides telling us happens when we hear the sound of the shofar?
Well, there's a little bit of teshuvah in this.
Yes, but not teshuvah necessarily the way we think about it. When we say the word teshuvah, what are the possible meanings we might give to that word?
Repentance.
So repentance, returning. In modern Hebrew, the word teshuvah means answer, right? A she'elah is a question, a teshuvah is an answer. Shuvah means to come back. But in this case, he actually adds a few other things. He adds, wake up, arouse yourself, stop sleeping, stop hitting the snooze button. It is time to get up from your slumber. And in some ways, the shofar, if you will, functions like a scale. Pay attention to the world and the balance that it is in or the balance that it is not in. And what do your actions do in terms of tilting it one way or the other? For once, pay attention to how you and your behavior and what you do impacts the global scale, if you will. That's a very different way of thinking about the shofar.
And the common saying is that save one person, save the world.
Sure,
Yeah,
right? Right out of the Mishnah too. Great.
This is very forward-looking.
Mm.
He's saying that, you know, regardless of what you've done in the past, your bad deeds tilted the fate, but you can make up for that by doing good deeds. It's not looking back at what you've already done wrong.
Great.
It's looking forward at just doing better now to make up for.
You got a second chance.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because one of the broader, sorry, go ahead, Julie.
No, I was saying every year you have a new chance.
Yes. In some ways, the Rosh HaShana and Yom Kippur is not only about examining the past. It's also about anticipating what might happen in the future. I'll give you an example. Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre is the first prayer that we say at the beginning of Yom Kippur, but it actually happens before Yom Kippur starts. All right, we take all the Torahs out of the ark. We create a model mock Beit Din, a rabbinic court, if you will. And we say this prayer that has to happen beforehand because what is Kol Nidre about?
Annulling the vows and promises from the previous year.
You're close.
in the coming.
That's right. It's about it's annulling the vows that we're going to make. It is an advanced directive, if you will. God, I know I'm going to make promises next year.
We'll stumble and fall.
I'm going to fall. I'm going to whatever. Will you just go ahead and cancel them now? Right? It's like a freebie in advance, not knowing what it is that we're going to do in that moment. And in some ways, Rosh HaShana and Yom Kippur are this kind of balance of what happened in the past, but also an anticipation of what we will do, what we might do differently, and what we know we're going to do anyway because we're human. And so we're acknowledging it from the outset.
Does that harken back to the Inquisition?
Say more. What part?
That when we said we were told to either give up Judaism or die or leave. And so many
Oh, I see.
gave up Judaism supposedly, although they kept it, And so this was a hearkening back to that time in the 1400s and thereafter.
Sure. Yeah. Probably yes, but my guess is that it's actually even earlier.
Oh.
Because forced conversions and those kinds of things happened earlier in history too. So I don't know if that's the reason per se, but the liturgy, the high holiday spirit, is a combination of the both looking back and the looking forward. If you wanted to look at, let's look at Sadia Gaon for a second. Sadia Gaon is one of the first to really put together a Siddur, a prayer book. Let's just go around the room and everyone take one. So Susan, why don't you start? He's going to offer 10 reasons for why we sound the shofar. Okay, I'm on page 4 in the middle of the page.
The sound of the shofar is analogous to the trumpet blast, which announced the coronation of a king. On Rosh HaShana, God created the world and became its sovereign. By sounding the shofar, we acknowledge God as our king.
Okay. So in some ways, the idea of God as Hamelech, I just want to acknowledge for a moment that the word Melech is a loaded term. Calling God king, it's very patriarchal. It's not gender neutral. It's a complicated thing. Many Siddurim are leaving it untranslated, either as Melech, or they're using words like sovereign, or I have actually seen Siddurim where they make it feminine and they make it Malka. Okay, but it's a hard word to think about as God as king, but so much of the stories of our tradition kind of invoke that language. Okay, go ahead, Adam.
Rosh HaShana is the first of the 10 days of the Atonement. And the shofar is sounded to stir our consciences, inducing us to comfort our past errors and turn to God, who is always ready to welcome the penance.
Okay, Adriana?
The shofar is reminiscent of God's revelation at Sinai, which was accompanied by the sounding of a shofar. It reminds us of our destiny to be a people of Torah, pursuing study of Torah and practicing commandments.
If you go back to Exodus chapter 19 and 20, right, as they're about to receive Torah, right, as Revelation's about to happen, there's a cloud on the mountain, there's thunder, there's lightning, there's trembling, and there's the sounding of horns. And so this idea of the sound of the horn was used in the moment of theophany, of God revealing God's self to us, God revealing God's face to us, right? Kind of like a calling to the divine. Sharon? Yeah, please.
The sound of the shofar is reminiscent of the exhortations of the prophets, whose voices rang out like a shofar in denouncing their people's wrongdoing and in calling them to the service of God.
Thank you. Bess?
The shofar reminds us of the destruction of the temple and calls upon us to strive for Israel's renewal and freedom and redemption.
Great. Marla?
The shofar, since it's a ram's horn, is reminiscent of the ram offered as a sacrifice by Abraham in place of his son Isaac. It thus reminds us of the heroic faith of the fathers of our people, who exemplified the highest devotion to God of which man is capable.
The shofar urges us to feel humble before God's majesty and might, which are manifested by all things and which constantly surround our lives.
The shofar is a reminder of the day of final judgment, calling upon all men and all nations to prepare themselves for God's scrutiny of their deeds.
Okay.
The shofar foreshadows the jubilant proclamation of freedom when the exiled and homeless of Israel return to the Holy Land. It calls upon us to believe at all times and under all circumstances in Israel's coming deliverance.
Great. And so on some level, that last one's referring to the Jubilee year or to the Shemitah year. Every 50th year, there's a sabbatical that kind of resets everything. But number 8, just for a moment, I guess the last one got changed in terms of the numbering. But number 8, when is that moment? Well, that's an interesting question. Is it the announcement of the final day, meaning the coming of the Messiah, or your death, or think about it for us today. When would we experience number 8? Yom Kippur, as the gates are closing at the very end, right before we eat. I'm sure that there is no connection there, but all right. It's kind of like, okay, let us blow the shofar and then you can all run and go get some food. But in that last moment, that's presumably the time when the gates are closing and final judgment is about to be sealed. Exactly. That's the moment in the Amidah, in the standing prayer of Ne'ilah, the final service. What does Ne'ilah mean?
Closing?
Locking.
Locking.
Locking. Lin'ol in modern Hebrew, na'ul is lock. We're locking the gates, not just closing the gates. We're locking them and sealing them in. And in that, we change the word from kotvenu to chotmenu, from writing it to sealing it in that moment. We are literally being sealed in. We're being etched in, and there's no way to undo it. By the way, there's always an extension in Jewish tradition. You can file extensions. Anyone know what the Jewish extension is of Yom Kippur, specifically on Sukkot? Mm-hmm.
Last Shmini Atzeret.
Hoshana Rabbah into Shmini Atzeret. When we take the willow branches and we beat them on the ground. It's a little bit pagan, but that's not for today. Okay, so turn the page for a moment. I want to look at a couple of stories that help us understand how the rabbis of our tradition are imagining the moment of the hearing of the shofar. So why don't we start with, we read some Rambam. Why don't we start with, in the middle of the page, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, where it says, listening or blowing, are they equal? Cindy, you want to read? Oh, Ellen, sorry.
I'm sorry, which one?
In the middle of page 5, where it says listening or blowing, by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs.
There were different views as to what constitutes the mitzvah of shofar. Is it to blow, in which the tokeah is fulfilling the command on our behalf, or is it to listen, in which case we all fulfill the commandment equally? In the end, the consensus was that the command is to listen. This is reflected in the blessing, who has commanded us to listen to the sound of the shofar, meaning to hear it with the intention of fulfilling the command.
Okay, so let's imagine we've just said this blessing. Interestingly enough, who says the blessing? The Baal Tekiah, the one who sounds the shofar. This is a very interesting kind of experience. The person who's going to blow the shofar is going to say, the one who commands us or sanctifies us with the mitzvah, with the commandment to hear the shofar, and then they're going to do the blowing. It's a little weird. And we're the ones who have to fulfill the mitzvah of listening, but we don't say the blessing. Now, many people will do it, but in general, it's the person who's going to blow the shofar who will do it. And so when we listen to the sound of the shofar, what do we listen for? What are we supposed to hear? You all shared emotions, you shared experiences, what are we supposed to listen to? What are we supposed to pay attention to in that moment?
The staccato, the sounds of the breaking up, the specific sound.
Great, so on some level, you just answered what the first question was that we started with. It's a Yom Truah, it is the day of the Truah. We don't know what the Truah sounds like. It either sounds like 3 + 9, just 3, or just 9. So we want to pay attention to that. If that's what we're focusing on, then what are we really hearing? What do those sounds evoke for us? Maybe. Or brokenness. Sadness. Pay attention for a moment to the brokenness. What are most people paying attention for? When's the Tikiyah Gedolah going to happen? Right? When's the big one going to come? Okay? All right. But maybe for a moment, we're supposed to pay attention to the brokenness. The brokenness around us, the brokenness for ourselves. Or maybe we're supposed to pay attention to the bookends. What is the bookend of the brokenness? The whole notes, the Tikiyah. One of the rules that we have in Jewish law is that you cannot have the middle stuff without the Tikiyah on either side. You can't have brokenness without it being bookended by wholeness. It's a really interesting image. Jewish tradition does not let us stay in brokenness. We have to find some way to get back to wholeness.
So
go ahead.
Put the broken sounds together, you have a continuum.
Yes. So what does the continuum evoke for you?
Well, life and improvement and how you relate to your society is going to go on.
Great.
After you're renewed.
Right. In some ways, if we only sit in the brokenness, then we've missed a part of Rosh HaShana too. We have to somehow get back to wholeness. Is there any moment in life where we actually have wholeness, where we're complete, where we're perfect?
Some might say when you're at birth.
Yeah, some might say birth. And is there any moment after brokenness when you can get back to wholeness?
Maybe moment.
Death. There may be moments, right? In some ways, they may actually be an image of life and death, right? The beginning of the shofar is the first moment of wholeness, and the last sound of the shofar is the last moment of wholeness. In death, we actually try to create equality between everyone. People are supposed to be buried the same way. They're supposed to go back to the earth the same way that they came. We create that sense of wholeness, or if we think about it kind of as the life continuum, we live for the most part between the wholenesses, right? Sometimes we're struggling, it's a little bit broken, but we can fix it. And sometimes it's earth-shattering and it's really hard to get out of it. We're struggling with something personally, with something globally, whatever it may be.
So we're talking about the sound that the shofar's making.
Yep.
And I feel like there's this moment after, someone says tekiah, before the shofar blower blows the shofar, where the sound is coming, but you don't know what it's going to sound like. And so, and then when they sound it, then it's like, okay, they're sounding it. Do you know what I mean? So this is like,
So I'm going to use,
and they're inhaling, right? Because they're getting ready, and then they're blowing. So there's this I don't know. It seems parallel to feeling like you're on a precipice, like death.
I love that. That's really beautiful. Yes. And the breath. It's all breath, right? Which is the source of life, right? That's the Makor Chaim. One of the things that's interesting, there are beautiful midrashim that talk about when you read Torah, when you read from the scroll, that if you're only looking at the letters, the black letters on the white, you're missing an entire part of the story. You have to look at the white space in between, right? The white space has its own story to it. In some ways, if we're only listening for the sound of the shofar, then we're not also paying attention to what happens just before it sounded and just after it's completed, right? There's the call, tekiah, right? There's a moment of silence in between. There's a sound, there's a breath, and then there's another call, right? If we're only hearing the sound, we may be missing something more beautiful, right? Sometimes it's in the spaces between that we learn so much about ourselves. So will you read the next one by Rabbi Sachs?
Rabbi Sachs comments on the Rambam saying, without an alarm call from heaven, Maimonides says, we can sleepwalk through our days. At the same time, one act can transform the world. How so? Our acts and interventions have vast ripples of consequences, spiritual, psychological, of which for the most part we are unaware. There are some effects we can only achieve if we do not intend to achieve them.
What do you think of Rabbi Sachs's comment? First of all, I love everything that he writes. If you don't read him, you should read him. If you do read him, then you'll hear me quote him a lot. What's he saying?
It makes sense to me because it just means that, maybe you take, for example, a day to go visit someone who's having a hard day, but you don't know that, going to cause them to, you kind of don't know the outcome, but it could be that that's a real changing moment.
Great.
We take things for granted, and the shofar can wake us up.
Yeah.
It seems to me that when we do a good deed, that we will never know really the consequences of it.
Yes. Right. Very nice.
We do it because we should do it, but the consequences are.
Right. And sometimes we do it without knowing not just how it impacted them, right? Or if they even knew that we did it. I mean, yeah.
Often if you think about all the good things that other people have done that positively impact me, but I have no idea the source of that.
Great.
And whatever, everything throughout your day, things go well, you kind of don't pay attention. It's when things go wrong that you pay attention. But those things going well require the good intentions of lots of people who you'll never see and meet.
Right.
And so it feels good to flip it like that too. And it makes you feel like the recipient of the good things, not just the potential giver.
Nice. I wonder if it also has the power to guide us to listen to the shofar blasts that are being shared in the world, not on Rosh HaShana and Yom Kippur. Can you go out into the world and hear the sounds that are around us that are calling us to do something or to pay attention to something? Is this a ritual that is isolated only to a couple days a year? Or is it a ritual that is supposed to help us pay attention to all of the things that are happening between this year and the year that comes? The analogy I'll give you is that in many Jewish communities on Shabbat and on other days, they'll offer a prayer for healing, a mishaberach for cholim. And there's a whole bunch of discussion we could have about whether or not the act of praying for someone else actually causes them to be healed. It's a very worthwhile conversation to have. But what I find myself thinking about when I read the name is I say to myself, I need to call this person this week. In some ways, for me, that's the shofar that's being sounded, yes, on Shabbat, internally, that I need to pick up the phone and create that shofar connection with somebody else. So I wonder sometimes, is the shofar not about Rosh HaShana, but about what happens between Rosh Hashanahs? Okay. All right, let's look at the teaching from Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. Mike?
Yes. One year, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev interviewed a number of candidates for the blowing of the shofar for Rosh Hashanah. What would be your thoughts as you are blowing? He asked each, but none of their answers satisfied him. Finally, one answered him thus: Rabbi, I am a simple poor Jew. I have 4 daughters, none of whom is married, and I cannot afford dowries for them. When I blow the shofar, I will be thinking, Merciful One, I am fulfilling the commandments you have ordained. Give ear to the shofar sound, beseeching you to fulfill your obligation to provide me dowries to my daughters. And simple honesty of this man touched Levi Yitzchak, and he engaged him to blow the shofar.
Okay, what's the story about?
To me, it's a two-way street.
Say more.
That God has to listen to him as well as he has to listen to the shofar.
That's a fascinating concept. I would take it even one step further. The sounding of the shofar may not only be for us. It may be for God. That's a really interesting idea. Why would we want God to hear the shofar?
Remind him we're here.
Okay. Don't forget us.
Don't forget us.
What'd you say?
Do the right thing.
Put me in that column. Okay. Right. Okay. Good. What else?
For God to listen to all of our other prayers.
Okay.
Not just in that moment.
Right. Hear us all the time, not just right now. Shema Kolenu. Hear our voices. Okay. What else?
We are his people.
Yes. Right. There's a connection, a connectedness to us. There's a covenantal relation to us.
We forgot.
Yes.
We're here.
And sometimes you forget.
We're here and we're yours.
That's right. Why else might we want God to hear the sound of the shofar? God, I want you to remember the time when you wrote that thing about the Trua and it didn't make sense. We still don't get it. I just want you to know it was a total, no.
Because when you're feeling some emotion, you want someone to hear you. So
Right.
it's basically like the child relationship with God is kind of like that, in a sense that you sound the shofar and it's like a magnification of maybe how you feel, so you can
Right.
have someone listen.
In some ways, it's a microphone, right? We're giving ear to what we feel. We want you to pay attention in our being vulnerable. What'd you say?
God the therapist.
Well, in some ways, yeah.
Or the sounding board. You know.
I had a teacher in rabbinical school. She was my chaplaincy supervisor, and she used to suggest that God was the eternal listener. You could say whatever you wanted to God. Not only would God not talk back, but God would listen in an unbiased, non-judgmental way. I thought that was a really powerful image of God as presence, God as listener. And so in some ways, I think that happens as well. Are people feeling like you need to go, or do you want to stay for a few more minutes? It's okay if you have to go. I think it was supposed to go to 8, but if you need to leave, by all means. But if you want to stay and study for a few more minutes, we can. Yeah.
I was gonna say, could you pick someone who's angry about the state of the world today, be thinking about the shofar as like, hey, God, come on.
Yeah. What's going on, right? Right, exactly. Exactly. So I want to turn to page 7 for a moment. Good night, Ellen. Thank you for coming. So there are a lot of different circumstantial cases that are given in the Talmud about how you blow the shofar. For example, one of the case studies is what happens if you happen to fall into a pit and you sound the shofar. If you blow the shofar from a pit, can you help someone else fulfill their obligation to hear the shofar? And what do you think the answer is? Yes, only if
They can hear it.
if they can hear the shofar and they are not hearing the echo of the shofar. Okay, so one of the case studies is this one that comes from Tractate Rosh HaShana, which says, Natan shofar betoch shofar. Why they would do this, I have no idea. But imagine for a moment that you had a big shofar, and inside the big shofar was a little shofar. Okay? Right. Im kol pnimi shama yatsa. Im kol chitzon shama lo yatsa. So you have a smaller shofar inside the larger shofar. If you hear the sound of the inner shofar, you are fulfilling your obligation of the mitzvah to hear the shofar. But if you hear the sound of the outer shofar, you have not. Why?
It was muffled by the shofar that was inside it, so you didn't hear the full sound of it.
Great. Maybe one was muffling the other, and you could not actually hear the authentic sound of the shofar. Anyone else want to venture a guess? Okay, you're not getting the full effect. Ah, right. Which is the actual one being blown, being sounded? How can I listen to it if I don't know? Okay. Whereas usually when someone sounds the shofar, you can tell who it is because you can see one person getting up to do it. What were you saying?
So if you listen to somebody blowing the shofar online,
Mm-hmm.
are you
That's a really interesting question. Yes. Yes. It depends on how many bars you have.